Okay, greetings everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. It's an honor to have all of you here. Time is precious, and I know Zoom can also be a space that can be a little bit tiring after the day. So for being here, this really means a lot. Your presence is valued and appreciated. And I'm really excited for today's presentation. I will let our esteemed presenter introduce himself. I know he has some words, but it is such a pleasure to have you here, Zosha, and I'm thrilled about your presentation. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in chat, and then I'm going to start talking. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. We have kind of a small group, which is fine, so we can make this a little more informal. I do have a PowerPoint that I want to pull up and just go through some concepts. And I know that for some of you here, maybe you've thought about these things or heard about these things before. But I'm going to sort of give an overview, and then I had uploaded some articles for people to look at, and I thought we could have a little discussion about those and hear what you all think. I don't want it to just be me talking for an hour and a half, because that's boring and everyone will fall asleep. But I did want to throw out a few concepts at first, in case some of you may not have heard of some of these terms or concepts that kind of frame this question of disability, social justice, and how do we put that back into DEI conversations and initiatives. So just a little bit about me. I grew up in the 70s and I was diagnosed with autism when I was an adult. That's pretty common for people in my generation. When I was little, there were some issues, and I remember teachers talking to my parents, but our ideas about autism have changed pretty dramatically over the last few decades. So my parents, who were even in, related fields, education, psychiatry, their viewpoint on it was, well, Zosha talks, so Zosha can't be autistic. That's impossible. Now we understand it's, much more complicated situation. I don't see it as all challenges though, all the time. I mean, I also had a lot of strengths, and one of my strengths is I can be very empathetic. And I think that that's a stereotype of autistic people that is really not true. Anyway, I'm also transgender, and I'm very out about that, because just in an educative way, I think that that's how we sort of destigmatize identities, by just being out and proud about who we are. I was working at the Hussman Center for Adults with Autism at Towson University here in Maryland for a long time, and I did a lot of different things there. I'm actually wrapping up my job there this month. I've also been consulting. So I've worked with autistic teenagers and adults for about 20 years, but it really encompasses more than just autism. A lot of them, have, other issues going on. Some of them have intellectual disability. A few of them have trisomy 21, or, they sometimes have physical disabilities. And before that, I've worked in vocational rehabilitation. So I've really worked with kind of the whole range of disabilities. Some of what I've been doing a lot lately, which is really interesting, is there seems to be kind of a real interest in corporations and businesses on retaining and supporting neurodiverse talent, because I think people are starting to realize that we're missing all these brains just because someone can't sit through a job interview. So that's been very interesting. Another thing that I've been doing a lot of is with clinicians, trainings and discussions and collaborations around how can we provide clinical support to people, but in a socially just way. And that's may become clearer as we go through what I'm going to be talking about today. So I have people do this exercise, and it works better when people don't really know each other and have no sort of, it may be the first time they're thinking about disability, or they haven't done disability work. And I know people in here have a little more expertise than that. So I'm not going to put everybody through it, but I'll explain it. And it works really good with undergraduates. Because I was teaching a class on autism, but it was through a critical disability theory lens, where we were not looking at autism, for clinical training. It was really diversity education. So I would have them pair up and come up with something that people have said is not so normal about them, and usually in pairs, and then they have to share. And then the idea is they're going to come back and share with everybody. And then they find out I don't really make them share. And they're usually really relieved, but I have them talk about how it felt. And they come to realize that it was very awkward and it was very uncomfortable for them. And I do that as at the outset, because I think what we're seeing is a paradigm shift where that's what we're going to kind of disrupt today, is this abnormal normal binary. And I made sort of a list of some of the questions that we're going to look at and talk to each other about. And again, I definitely really want to hear from you and what your thoughts on these questions are. So one, how is disability as a social construct used to sustain oppression? And why do we know so little about ableism? Why is reducing ableism important for reducing other forms of discrimination? And how can DEI initiatives incorporate disability justice concerns? And what can we do as self-advocates and allies? Okay, so this is where I'm gonna jump in and just give a little overview of some concepts. And again, some of you I know are experts in this and could, teach this too, but some of you may not have heard of this, or, just need a refresher on some of these terms. So ableism is just, in a nutshell, that's discrimination against people with disabilities. Benevolent ableism, it can happen with other isms too, but I see it a lot when it comes to disability, which is, this idea that we have to be really nice to people with disabilities and they're innocent, and we have to jump in and help them all the time. And it really comes out of some of those implicit biases that disabled people are, kind of childlike, and they never really grow up, and they're incompetent, and because of their impairments, they can't do anything. That's I think explicit bias, the kind of biases that you can see, and the implicit biases, that's something that comes with, all of these, sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, but in particular, there's this benevolent ableism that I think is very sticky and tricky to unwind, because humans are helpful and we do want to help each other. And sometimes it can be hard for someone with a disability to do something. So we have to just think about it in a new way, like, how can we help in an authentic way, but not in a way that infantilizes people or kind of strips them of their autonomy. I use identity first language, and so I just wanted to explain that for a moment too. So we came up with person first language, which is what you're going to see if you read a journal article or the New York Times. It's kind of the official way of referring to disability, where people will say person with a disability. Or they'll say, I'm an adult with autism. And the intention was to be, very sensitive and nice, that they're a human being. They just happen to have this thing. But a lot of self-advocates don't like it and have pushed back against it, because there's nothing shameful about being autistic. And so they're just more comfortable saying I'm autistic, or, the disabled people are, coming to the conference, something like that. So I just wanted to put that out there, because sometimes people are like, why are you saying that? Isn't that, shouldn't you say person with a disability? And actually for some of us, we're more comfortable with disabled person, because it's part of who we are, and it's not a problem. And so it's kind of the work to destigmatize the language. All right, hang on a second. So I'm sorry, let me go back a second. Yeah, okay. So I threw in a few pictures here because some of you are familiar with this history, but a lot of people aren't. So there's a change going on in the disability world, where we're looking at disability as not someone's personal problem or, you know, something that they have to struggle and overcome, but that this is a social justice issue. So I don't know if people know about this sit-in in San Francisco. They had passed a law in 1973, the Rehabilitation Act, that required accommodations. But okay, so when you pass a law, then, you know, Congress or whoever has to make all the regulations, right? So, you know, what does accommodations mean and how do you do it and how's it paid for and all these other, you know, the minutia of it. And that had just stalled. And disabled people were pushing and pushing for people to get the regulations passed. And it still hadn't happened by 1977. And so the Health, Education, and Welfare Department, they were the ones in charge of getting the regulations passed and completed, and they were the ones dragging their feet. So that, you know, federal departments have their, you know, regional offices all over the country. So at the one in San Francisco, they were protesting, and they wound up occupying the building, and they took over it for about 27 days. It was the longest sit-in in US history. And it's also interesting because we were not talking about intersectionality yet, but this definitely was successful due to intersectional organizing and efforts. So for example, the Black Panthers came and provided food so that they could stay in the building. And it was successful. The regulations got passed. This is a great photo. This is the Philadelphia bus boycott in 1990. And they were protesting the fact that buses were not accessible. And it's not meant to be dismissive of other, you know, social justice struggles, but this gentleman has a sign on the back of his wheelchair that says, "I can't even get to the back of the bus." So this is sort of a taste of some of the changes that we're seeing. And so we can think of it in terms of models or paradigms. And the old model that we hope is going out the window was what they call a medical model. It's not anti-medicine, but it was started by doctors essentially. And the idea was to normalize people with disabilities. We've really switched to a social model, which is more about accessibility. And, you know, that's not just in terms of buildings and ramps, but also attitudes. Now we're seeing kind of another change where we're moving to diversity model, or sometimes in the, you know, neurodiversity community, it's the neurodiversity model, but it's kind of parallels the diversity model in physical disability community, where it's about empowering disabled people and protecting diverse traits. So that's going to come up a little bit more. So I'm just kind of throwing the ideas out there. So this is a great example of a social model. It's curb cut. You know, we don't make wheelchair users learn how to walk or stay home if they can't. We changed society. You know, we said everyone should have a right to go out and do the different things they want to do and go to school and go to the movies. This is kind of an example of a diversity model approach. This is Sue Austin. She's an artist who became a wheelchair user, and she wanted to scuba dive, and everyone said that's impossible. So she invented a chair that can be submerged in the water and that she self-propels, but could also be propelled by a motor. So this is her scuba diving. And so I think the neurodiversity or slash diversity model is not like a rose-colored glasses idea. It can be very frustrating if, you know, you can't do something. But out of our frustrations and limitations, we invent and we evolve. So the part of this concept is that human communities need diversity to thrive in the same way that the planet needs biodiversity. So that's kind of this sort of sea change that we're seeing going on. Not that accommodating is bad, do all the accommodating in the world, but the diversity model wants to push us even further to value diverse traits. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing here at this point. These are the articles that I had had people look at. The Nerio Redmond et al. Article is great, and it really goes through the kinds of ableism and just how stereotyping operates, and looks at some of the ambivalent attitudes that people have towards people with disabilities. For example, at one point they talk about how most people will say, oh yeah, everyone should have equal access, but then they feel really annoyed if they have to wait a long time on the bus to get a wheelchair onto the bus. So I'm going to focus on the Bainton article and the Evans et al. Article today for our discussion. So I'm going to pause the PowerPoint here and just see if anybody had any thoughts or comments on the sort of overview of concepts before we really get into the articles and some of the questions that, we're going to tackle today. Chastity, go ahead.
Sasha, hi. I didn't get a chance to pre-read the articles. Am I still going to be able to participate?
Oh yes, thank you. I'm glad I forgot to mention that. It's okay if you didn't see them yet, because what we'll do is we'll take a look at them anyway together, and you can glance at it really quickly.
Yeah, you know what I can do is if you're okay with this, if you want to direct message the session host your email, I can just put everybody on the email right now and I can send out the articles to you, no problem. So I'm seeing some people are coming through, and okay. Yes, we can do this. I got it. You got to love technology at this point. Wonderful.
Right.
Thank you. I see emails coming in. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Hillary, I didn't see you for a second. I was like, wait.
I know. It's okay. I'm hiding out. You got it.
So she can send the articles. And I can also put them up on the screen. That's another way to do it too. Let's see. So while those are getting emailed, let me just see, did anyone have any immediate thoughts on what I had put out there as sort of some of the intro concepts? Has everybody heard of these models of disability?
So I am on the faculty advisory board for our disability services at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm a Fielding grad. And the thing that I run up against is that there's no mandated learning. Professors are not really trained on their legal obligations under the ADA, let alone a more inclusive model. So I've spent a lot of my year yelling at other professors. So one of the things that seems like a big gap to me is like, even with like surface level mandated training, we get that for the Civil Rights Act, we get that for Title IX, we get that for other laws that we are equally beholden to as ADA, but we don't get ADA training, at least in the public institution I'm working at. So I'm just curious about like, why is that? why are we so unfamiliar with these, historic events that led to these, major changes in how we're supposed to be constructing our society?
I think we're gonna have, insight on that as we go through this discussion. I have like the big answer, and then I have some, down to earth, more technical answers. So in a nutshell, I think there is a gap, right? And, I could answer it like, well, so we have to do more training, and we could look at, why that doesn't happen and how we could make it happen. But I think I'm thinking in a bigger picture, philosophical way. And I think that there are some real reasons why disability hasn't been on the radar, because it really disrupts inequity and unequal paradigms in our society, and that's a challenge. It really calls on us to value diversity, and sometimes I want to think we're sort of getting there, and then it's sort of like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and 1 step forward, and 4 steps back, and so that's something that we're gonna look at. Carl, not to put you on the spotlight, but do you have any thoughts about that? Because I know you do a lot with accessibility.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, there's a couple of things. Yeah, with I've been in the Section 508 of the Rehab Act part about IT technology and stuff. But then the other part of it is the 504, which is the civil rights protections, which is reasonable accommodation. What's a reasonable, it's like, I've been whole weeks where just lawyers talking about what does undue burden mean. And it's like, you want to go, So there's a couple things, but
Yeah, I've dealt with 504 both in K through 12 and in universities. And in K through 12, they're under a little bit more scrutiny and it's a little bit more nailed down, even though that doesn't mean that they really accommodate as much as they should. But in the university environment, the reasonable accommodations is a giant loophole that people drive trucks through because they just feel that anything that makes them do more work is unreasonable.
Well, yeah, and I think that the one article that I'm not going to get into too much today, the one by Nerio Redmond, gets into that a little bit. That's what she's talking about. The authors are talking about with that ambivalence that comes in with disability justice. You know, if you talk to these professors, they would say, oh yeah, of course, everyone, you know, who's capable of doing college should be able to come, even if they have a disability. But then if you're like, well, you have to spend an extra 15 minutes making sure your PowerPoints are accessible. They're like, what? You know, no, if they're in college, they should be able to read a PowerPoint. You know,
Right,
like
they have to give an additional exam because someone was incapacitated because they have a chronic illness. I've run across that a bunch of times.
right, you know, and I dealt with that a lot in my university, and I was very accommodating. So a lot of the students in my class were just like, so, you know, that was so refreshing for them and empowering too, because they're like, it's the first class where I don't have to fight and explain that I'm not asking for something special. It's leveling the playing field so I can read the article also, you know? And so yeah, we have a lot of catching up to do in that department, definitely. Any other thoughts or comments? I think what we'll do is, let me see what you all think. We could divide into two and have each group in a breakout section look at one of the articles, and then that would also give you time to glance at it if you hadn't. Or we could just say, okay, let's look at the first article, let's look at the second article, and just talk all amongst ourselves. What do people feel would work better for all of you? I know it's kind of the end of the day and people might be tired too.
If anyone did not get the articles, I think I got everyone on here. If not, go ahead and ping me again, and I'll be happy to get those out. And Zosha, I have to tell you, wow, already, even in the first, 20 minutes, it's just been incredible. It looks like there might be some votes in the chat.
Yeah, I think everybody, or I'm seeing more people saying, let's just stay together. So I think what I'll do is I'll share a PDF of the first article on the screen. Hang on a second, I've just have so many things open all the time. Let's see. Hillary, do you have the ability to put it up on the screen? I'm trying to do a share, and for some reason it won't show PDFs. I know sometimes that happens.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm wondering, you know what I could do? I could try it from my end since I have them. Yeah, and which one would you like to go through first?
The Bainton one. Let's take a look at that.
All right, let's try that out. I think Zoom gets tired at this time of day.
Yeah, even the computers get tired.
Okay. And are you able to view this on my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
I think everybody can see it. So this article by Bainton, Disability and the Justification of Inequality in American History. I know some of you haven't looked at it. In essence, what Bainton has done is he's gone back and he's looked at movements for social justice, for example, against racism or against sexism, or also in terms of immigrant justice. And what he was noticing is that, you know, disability is seen as abnormal, and disabled people are broken, they're deficient, they're lacking. And what he saw happen in history is that oftentimes discrimination against enslaved people, for example, was justified by saying that people of African descent inherently are disabled and broken. Or for example, with women, they would say, that gender is inherently abnormal. They would say things like, hysteria of the mind, that's automatically the case in women. So we have to sort of look at that first problem, which is how, rendering people, abnormal, broken, disabled, was used to justify all kinds of discriminations. But then there was another problem, which is that if you look at the movements to gain freedom and to gain rights among the suffragettes and against racism, what happened is that a lot of times those groups would say, well, we want our rights and we should have our rights because we're not disabled. As if the really disabled people did deserve discrimination, but we're not really in that horrible group. So we should have our rights. And that really has not been deconstructed well in scholarship. So he's attempting to do that. And then, what comes out of that is this idea that, that I came upon, which is that, we're doing all this work, DEI has become, more centered, especially in universities and sometimes in corporations, and that's great. But if we aren't undoing this sort of able, not able, normal, abnormal paradigm, well, we can always call some group abnormal and oppress them out of their abnormality. So we have to get rid of the idea that there's some abnormal people. So that makes combating this ableism and this idea that some people are not normal, we have to unwind that if we're going to unwind any other prejudices. So it's kind of a complicated argument, but so he sort of walks through the history step by step, and then that's some of the ideas that were generated for me. That's not to say that all work has to be around that. There's many different works and projects and things that need to happen, but as long as we have that as a fundamental operating assumption in our society, that some people are normal and some people are abnormal, and the abnormal ones don't have to have rights, they don't have to be included, they don't have to be valued, they don't have to be part of everything that's going on because of their abnormality. As long as we have that as a really foundational idea in our civilization, it's always going to be used against somebody. So we're never gonna totally get rid of oppressive structures and hierarchies until we start paying some attention to that and undoing that. If you have it in your email and you want to pull it up, or we can scroll down here and see a little bit. If people were able to glance at it, or if they want to take a glance at it now and see what they think, or if they just have some reactions to some of the ideas that I just kind of threw out there.
So I cover some of this more from the feminist and racial perspective in a lot of my courses, but I teach a gender and sexuality course now as well. So like obviously the intersectional perspective very much is engaged in this. So I found a lot of resources for my students who aren't aware of things like a hysterectomy is the removing of hysteria from women because our uteruses detach from our bodies and bang around and hit our organs, and that's why we're so weird. Like all of that. But race science, to justify enslavement was also a big part of it. And so this may be a little bit sort of like surface level for you, but have you ever used The Body is an Anthropology and that author's work? Because it does sort of pull together race, gender, sexuality, and disability into sort of this idea of a hierarchy of bodies. And I know that's more of a sort of popular novel and not as grounded in scholarship as what you're doing. But how do you feel about that as a way of like introducing people to those concepts and to the idea that a hierarchy of bodies is constructed and creates inequity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good resource, especially, as we're introducing people to this idea. But I think, and that's why when I said, okay, the big sort of philosophical answer to your question, because it's, that's what we're trying to get around to, is that all of these things, like who's normal or who's not normal, we decided that.
Right.
So we can undecide it. And there's some important reasons to undecide it.
Yeah.
But that's big work, but that's why I think, right now we're seeing sort of a reactionary response, with the whole critical race theory in schools, and, some of the transphobia, the rise in transphobia, some of the anti-Asian hate that we've seen, the Black Lives Matter, all of these things, because I think we've made some headway, and it is making people nervous, because it's unwinding. You need that thread to keep, the society's hierarchies and power systems intact, and people are pulling on that thread. So, people are pulling back, trying to keep the thread in there.
Cool. These are great
Yeah.
resources. Thank you.
I'll put a couple of quotes from the article here in the chat. So there's this quote, and then maybe we can talk about some of the quotes. Come on, Zoom. Not only has it been considered justifiable to treat disabled people unequally, but the concept of disability has been used to justify discrimination against other groups by positioning women and minorities and immigrants as abnormal, broken, deficient, deviant, which is what I was talking about earlier. And then later on, okay, another quote. Let me copy this here. The concept of normal creates social hierarchies that justify the denial of legitimacy and certain rights to individuals or groups who get deemed not normal. And then there was one more quote I can pull up. Give me a second here. We tacitly accept the idea that disability is a legitimate reason for inequity, making discrimination against people with disabilities so persistent and the struggle for disability rights so difficult. Someone mentioned they have to leave. That's okay. It'll be recorded, so you can listen to the rest later. I know it's getting towards the end of the day for people in different time zones. So that's the heart of, this issue that connects all of these different oppressions together, is this fundamental dehumanizing and denormalizing of whichever group you're trying to vilify. Yeah, and if you look back in the history, like that you were talking about, like the hysterectomy, where that word comes from, and Bainton goes into very specifically to how enslaved people were literally diagnosed with conditions, and it's really horrible. It's really horrible to read, but it's history that we have to wrestle with. For example, there was a condition where, if an enslaved person was freed, they wouldn't be able to function. So freedom made them unable to function. So the I think it was drapetomania. So they actually would literally, they had these diagnoses that they would slap onto people. Any other thoughts or questions on this?
I'm not too versed specifically in psychology and cognitive psychology, but I do remember at one point reading that there is like some sort of like human like schema, apparently, that we like to make sense of the world through creating hierarchies. I'm not sure how valid that is necessarily, but it makes me wonder. It's like, if we were to, you know, move forward with creating like sort of campaigns and marketing and just educational awareness to dismantle hierarchies in general, would that help in some ways of like making sure that inequalities aren't so prevalent, you know, like, because there's just an idea of like one has to be at top and then there's rungs and stuff like that. But if we can change the thinking of that, would that assist in some way, you know? But yeah, that's just some thought that came into my mind with the second quote that you listed there.
That's an excellent question. And I think that bridges us to the next article. So maybe we'll put that up in a minute. But so the question is, what can we do? And I do think human brains to a degree are wired to judge. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like that's how we stay alive. Like, okay, you know, that vegetable is poisonous, that vegetable is good to eat, right? So, I mean, we have to be able to put things in categories. The problem is when we do it about people and their identity and things that they can't change. And you're right, we may always have our reactions, but so that's the big question, you know, and a lot of it's implicit. And that's why implicit bias is so hard to unwind. When we see explicit bias, good people can be like horrified by that. Like, what do you mean someone can't have that job because they're a woman? Like, you know, that doesn't make sense. But the implicit, so a lot of people think, well, I don't have explicit bias. I can't possibly have implicit bias, but we know that that's not true. There's actually a test of implicit bias you can take, and it's really surprising. I'll see if I can pull up that link in a second. So that's sort of the big question on the table. And unwinding implicit bias, we can't do it the same way we work on explicit bias because of the brain processes. It's a different process. And so that's kind of what the next article asks, like, okay, so if we want to unwind this and we want, you know, to upend some of these oppressive hierarchies and change paradigms, like, so what can we do? So Hillary, could you put up the Evans article? We could throw that article up here, and that can kind of bridge us to this question of, you know, okay, so we want to be allies. So what is it that we can do? So in this Evans article, they focus on disability, but I think you could apply the concepts to any of these, like racism, sexism, homophobia, in that question of what do we do? Again, they're using the specific example of disability, and they're looking at how, in some ways it's similar to other isms, but there are a few differences that they wanted to call out at first. So, for example, because of that medical model that I spoke about a few minutes ago. All right, so we've got an idea that, you know, it says right here, disability as an innate medical condition rather than the creation of societal oppression. And that makes it hard to understand that individuals with disabilities would benefit or need allies. You know, it's hard to see it as a social justice issue. You know, but society creates disability by defining what is normal and what is not normal. So we know it's a social construct. So he talks about, for example, needing exposure to alternative narratives, for example. That's one thing that can counteract some of the implicit bias. You know, we have so many narratives in society about disabled people, you know, that their lives are tragic, that they need a cure. So countering that it is one way to begin to chip away at implicit bias, because when you hear different stories, it challenges those implicit levels. You know, I think there's something, has anybody here heard of the term inspiration porn? Kind of a funny term.
Mm-hmm. That, yeah.
What have you all heard about it?
From what I've heard, it's, you know, if this person who has, like, you know, who's in a wheelchair, could do this and this, then your life isn't that hard. You could do it too. It's like primarily aimed at using like a disabled person for an able-bodied audience as inspiration for overcoming difficulties.
Yeah, so I think you hit on a key point, which is that it's objectifying. You know, if someone makes a speech in front of 10,000 people and it's a great speech, it's okay to authentically be proud of them and say, hey, that was a great job. But, you know, you will see with disabled people, like they'll get an award because they brushed their teeth. Like, you know, or you'll see this poster and it's, I don't know, somebody with no legs playing soccer, and it will be like, well, what are you complaining about? You know, so it sort of objectifies disabled people as if it's so triumphant that, you know, it's very dehumanizing. You know, they're just regular people going about their day, like trying to play soccer with their friends and get their teeth brushed and go to school and do all the things everybody else is doing. There's nothing congratulatory about opening the ketchup. It's just dinner time, you know? So I think, you know, disrupting that is another thing that people can do. I think that also gets at the implicit biases, because it comes out of those implicit biases that their lives are so tragic, and here he's a hero because he's actually getting up in the morning. You know, it's like we can push back on that. I think another thing that people can do, hang on a second, I just, I'm going to put my slides back up. Give me a second here. I'm going to come down to, I made a list, and it's not an exhaustive list, and perhaps like you all have some more things that we could add. Okay, let me go from here. Current slide. Hang on. Okay, I'm just going to go this way. Okay. So I think when we're doing research and scholarship on decolonizing, say decolonizing curriculum, or, you know, any of the other sort of decolonizing work that's going on, decolonizing epistemology, you know, putting disability into that and being sure that that's included in whatever it is that we're trying to deconstruct, you know, to see where that intersection is. I think contact. Have people heard of contact theory? Hang on a second. I have to open this up so I can see everybody. Have people heard of contact theory by Alport? He was a sociologist in the 1950s, and he was very concerned about this issue of racism and how do we make people unracist, because he saw the beginning of the civil rights movement, and you can make a law that says, you know, everyone's allowed to eat lunch at the diner, but that doesn't necessarily make white people less racist. So he had an idea that you could bring groups together, and through contact, the implicit bias could go down. But he said it had to have very specific conditions. If you just throw people together without thinking about it, it could actually make stereotypes worse. So if you're going to do contact on purpose to reduce bias, the two groups have to come together as equals. They have to participate in a mutually meaningful activity. And they have to spend some amount of time together. It can't be like a one-off pizza party to meet the gay people in college. Like that's not going to reduce your homophobia, right? So, you know, it's got to be some period of time. And it also has to be, you know, some degree of intimate contact, right? So if you know, get together to watch a movie, you're not really talking to each other. You're not really getting to know each other. And then he also felt that like you need some expert guidance to have, you know, conscious conversations, to break tension, to, you know, encourage people to interact with each other. So those were his conditions. So that's what I sort of put contact here on my list. You know, teaching disability history, but keeping that intersectional lens in it. And not, you know, a lot of times we'll do disability history, but it's like, oh, Helen Keller, you know, the life of some great, interesting disabled people, when it's really more complicated, like the Bainton article suggests, right? turning leadership over to disabled people when there's a disability issue on campus, or there's, things that are going on, perhaps like in the media, and listening to what disabled people have to say about it. Because you are not in that marginalized group, so it may not, you may not even be aware that they're upset about something, or that they have a view that something is harming to them and that they need things to be done a different way. I think watching out for bias and disability language, that's another thing that can really sort of chip away at implicit bias. So I hear people will say all the time, oh yeah, he's wheelchair bound. Wheelchair users do not like that. Nobody is bound to a wheelchair. It's actually a lot of people in the physical disability community, the day they get their wheelchair, they call it Freedom Day, because they can go wherever they want without a staff person or someone like dragging them around. So it's just a tool. Some people wheel around, other people walk. So the more we can destigmatize this in our language and watch what we're saying and question ourselves and be like, well, wait a minute, another great one, you'll see in textbooks about autism, woefully deficient in social skills. Well, wait a second, who says, like what is a social skill? Isn't that very cultural, and even individual? There's some quote unquote normal people who are, well, I won't call them woefully deficient, but I wouldn't necessarily want to hang out with them. So, I think it's questioning assumptions and norms. That's another big one. And then the last one on my list was destigmatizing human variance. So when we see someone who's different, opening ourselves up to that and be like, okay, I haven't necessarily experienced this yet, but let me see what this person's about. For example, if you see someone who doesn't speak, they still have a lot to say. They're still intelligent. They're still a human being. I know several non-speaking people who go to college. So just really holding back for a minute and be like, wait, why did I think that? And being. I always call it being comfortable with being. Being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So those are a few things on my list. I don't know, did anybody have other things that I think I put it under this umbrella of restoring disability justice to DEI endeavors, but that's connected to your question, right? Because it's the implicit biases, I think, that is the reason why disability hasn't really been in the mix and in the conversations or in the teacher training, for example.
Yeah, really appreciating your insight so far. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I'm also curious to know about the term for neurodiversity, how the context, how it came about, and how maybe you feel about that in terms of education or overall.
Well, more specifically, you mean like what does the term mean or refer to, or my feelings about the term?
Or yeah, or your thoughts on if that is more applicable in context, or would it more fully describe the spectrum of abilities of individuals overall?
I could go into a whole workshop on that question just in and of itself. Briefly, I think we're seeing, the neurodiversity movement was really started by the autism community in the 1990s. And so we've been talking about neurodiversity forever, but it's this new hot thing. But I think that what the message there was that, again, not a rose-colored glasses thing. Some things can, be very, very frustrating, but that diversity is really very important for human communities, and we need all these diverse traits. I always tell a story about how I have these students and they do this service learning with the autistic adults. So they'll go up to the Huston Center and they'll be like in fitness together. And going back to contact theory, they're equals. They're not there as helpers or volunteers. They're all just going to work out together. That's that mutually meaningful activity. And they know that they're graded on it, right? So there was the student who was paired with a gentleman who's nonverbal. And the student non-speaking, came running to me very upset and was like, this isn't fair. How am I supposed to get to know him? He doesn't speak. And I said, oh, wait, the only way to be friends is to chat. Like, go invent a new way to be together, you know, and we would miss that if this guy was just segregated, you know, and that's why we need all this different. Anyone here use the Starbucks mobile app? Yeah, very convenient, right? Yeah, wonderful. It was developed because non-speaking and non-hearing people were so frustrated trying to order a coffee. They were like, I just want a coffee. And it's, see, you guys, you got to come up with another way of ordering coffee. Well, now we all love it. It's great. So, you know, in other words, disability kind of plays a role in keeping societies from stagnating. So going back to your question about neurodiversity, I think that was kind of the heart of the message, and it really spoke to other disabilities, not just autism. And so now we've come to a point where neurodiversity is sort of like this umbrella where other people who maybe have intellectual disability or ADHD or trisomy 21, they're like, hey, I'm neurodiverse too. And I want to be respected for my mix and for what I bring to the table. And the autism community is like, great, okay. We jokingly will sometimes say, you know, frontal lobe cousins, because a lot of these disabilities are, you know, located in the frontal cortex. So I think it's taken on that meaning in society, and it's sort of now a word that signifies, hey, you know, there's all kinds of diversity, and you know, we want to be centering that as important in human life to protect, even as we're helping people with their challenges. You know, that's okay. Like I said, all the accommodating, you know, supporting people in clinics. You know, I can testify to the fact that, you know, years ago when I was just getting started, you walk into clinics where they were doing work with autistic kids, and there really still was that paradigm of how do we get this kid normal? And it's really changed. You know, they're really deeply saying, you know, because self-advocates have said, you know, that's too hard to internalize. That's too much pressure. And what's normal anyway? You know, I just want to be me and I don't want to be stigmatized. But, you know, there's still wonderful skills to learn. So it's more about, okay, what do you want to do and what's meaningful to you? And that's why we're coming in with supports, not to make you normal. You know, we want people to contribute out of their diversity, not in spite of it. So I don't know if that answers your question, kind of a long-winded answer. Any other thoughts or comments?
Just posted a link. Last Thursday was Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and there was actually a non-speaking valedictorian speech that they were showing.
Mm-hmm.
And even back late 90s, one of the projects we had, they had built the whole solution into another laptop, and we actually had at Stanford, their webmaster was quadriplegic, was using like a mouth puffing thing. He managed their whole website, so people like, it was just kind of showing people that the capabilities can be there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's also an article about a University of California student who recently won a scholarship for a PhD. He was majority not nonverbal, but through the studies and their writing, were able to pursue doctoral study as a student at the University of California.
Yes, and that's one side of a coin. I do want to throw out there that sometimes people who are neurodiverse do have, for example, special talent in a certain area, you know, or, you know, for example, this person who's non-speaking and who go to college. But I've worked with some people who have really, really significant impacts of their impairments, and they're not going to go to college. They're not going to write essays. They don't have a special skill, and their diversity still brings really important sort of innovative flow to the communities that they're part of. So we want to we want to honor that too, right? That it's not about being a super crip. It's just that recognizing all this different diversity wherever it is, wherever it's showing up, it's healthy, it's good. We need it in our societies.
I wanted to almost make that an action step. I don't know if that's right, but just delighting in it, just being happy, enjoying what you're learning from other people, because I know that's my experience in the work that I've done. I just am learning all the time.
I love that. I should put that on there. Thank you for adding that in. And I think that's where you see some of like, neurodiversity pride online or, in t-shirts, things like that.
I think another point too would be like having the highest respect and regard for someone, like even if they're able-bodied or disabled, that they deserve respect and accommodations, even if they don't have like economic value, so to speak, under capitalism. And I think
Yes.
that's something that, people might think, oh, well, they're disabled, but they're contributing to society, so they're good. And then someone who doesn't or is unable to contribute to society economically or whatever, that they're somehow less. Like even then there's kind of like that tension, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for adding that. And that's sort of what I was alluding to. There's a lot of scholarship coming out around that too, about how you can't really undo the bad parts of capitalism without undoing ableism, because what you would really be calling for is to value people more for than just being able to labor for profit. There's some people who can't do that and are still valuable human beings and contribute in other ways. And so that's a very important point. There's a new book called The Future is Disabled. It hasn't come out yet, so I haven't read all of it. I've seen a little bit. And also another one called Capitalism and Ableism. So there, I can put together a few resources. I did put some things like more to explore here at the end, but it was more popular stuff like movies and things like that. I did put an overview of critical disability theory, which is being used more and more often as a method similar to critical race theory to analyze issues, to analyze history, to analyze theories, with that end in mind of liberating people. I had thought, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Was someone going to say something?
Oh, well, just I'd also posted in a link to a book I had discovered on, and that's pretty new too, on intersectionality. So the connections between intersectionality and disability, and kind of really transcending the various categories that we kind of, and what you thought of that, or if you've been running into that thread.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that ties into Bainton's article, and he was taking a very early look at that. And his article is not as well known as I wish it was, but yeah, that's what he's speaking to, is that this is all tied together. It's all, we can look at this oppression or that oppression, and they have the same root. And I have some ideas about what that root is. But yeah, so if we're trying to untangle one, we kind of have to untangle the other, and recognize too that it matters. Like another thing that's been going on a lot here in Baltimore is we'll have all this autism advocacy and they'll think, okay, well, we need to focus on X. But then you can go into the inner city. Baltimore is 90% Black, African-American, and people have autism and other neurodiversities in the school system in the inner city. They're focused on something totally different. For example, I work with young adults, and we've had so many interactions with the police that went south very quickly. For example, there was an African-American gentleman who is autistic, and so he rocks back and forth and he's very stimmy. And a number of times police have assumed that he's on drugs. So we've done a lot of police training, but you see, if we're not holding that intersectional lens and listening to people, because all these identities matter, so what someone who's white and autistic is worried about is maybe very different than what someone who's Black and autistic is worried about. So we have to do the analysis through intersection, but then also our advocacy has to be intersectional in nature. So that's very important too. So one thing I thought to end on, because I do like to, let me see if I can make these slides go backwards. Just to give people a minute or two, it doesn't have to be exactly 5 minutes, but just a minute or two of quiet to just sort of reflect on, what you might do, or what you might carry forward as a result of meeting here today and talking about these topics, or, something new that now you're inspired and you might do something in your classroom or at your workplace or in the DEI initiatives you're already part of. And give people a minute or two to think about that, and then maybe we could all share. And Hillary, maybe this is the point where you could shut off the recording so people could feel like they could share on a more personal level and it's not going to be recorded for the whole world.
Perfect, will do.
Okay.
I'm going to go right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.